Marxist newspaper.
There you go, star.com.
This is the Liberty Radio Network, broadcasting the latest liberty-oriented audio content 24 hours a day at LRN.FM.
All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. Talking with Haroon Siddiqui. He writes for the Toronto Star. That's thestar.com. And his article in question here is To Tackle Domestic Terrorism, End Foreign Wars. And well, you emphasize democracies and how we can't let, bad guys who kill civilians or plot to determine what our foreign policy is and all that. And it reminded me that Robert A. Pape, the professor from the University of Chicago, who wrote the book Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, emphasizes that suicide attacks don't really work in China, and the Uyghurs try it sometimes, but the Politburo really doesn't care. The Politburo in China figures that we got 1 billion plus Chinese. What do we care if you blow up some? They're not going anywhere, and so the pressure doesn't really work on them. But suicide attacks, especially terrorism in general, is much more effective against democracies because they have to at least pretend that they're our servants and that they have our best interests in mind. And so the purpose of terrorism, of course, is in the reaction. It's asymmetric warfare. And so if they can get us to bog ourselves down in the mountains of Afghanistan and bleed our empire to death and crash it on the rocks the way they did the Soviet Union, that's fine. But if they can convince the American people that it's not worth living in a police state in order to protect ourselves supposedly from terrorism all the time, that maybe we ought to just abandon our empire, well, then that's just as good too. And so that's why this kind of tactic is especially effective against Canadians and Americans, for example. It's why we ought to pay attention, because who does want to live in a police state or an empire anyway?
The chief conclusion that Professor Pape made in that book was the following, that no sooner had occupations ended than the suicide attacks also ended. So there is a correlationship between the two that he drew that some people don't want to hear about. But that was his conclusion after a very scientific study, that no sooner had the occupation ended than the suicide bombing and the terrorism also ended. And you were talking about the mountains of Afghanistan. I mean, I covered the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan 1980 to 1988, and we are seeing an exact replay of what transpired at that time. Now, NATO is not as cruel and as inhumane as the Russian troops were, who were doing literally carpet bombing of some villages and so on. But nonetheless, in terms of the guerrilla tactics, exactly what happened then is happening now. How was that war waged against the Soviet soldiers and so on? By the Afghan Mujahideen, and whom and where did they mount their counterattack from? Across the border from Pakistan. Who supported them? Ronald Reagan and the CIA and the Saudis. So that jihad was good. This jihad happens to be against us, so it is bad. So we need to develop some consistency and some logic and have some sense of history as to what is happening today and compare it to what we did before.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chalmers Johnson in his book, I guess in both, in Sorrows of Empire and in Nemesis, says that the choice of empires really, when it comes down to it, is to give it up or to live under it. And so he says, the Romans chose basically to bring their empire home and turn the place into a nightmare, in Rome itself. And then, of course, the whole thing collapsed anyway. They weren't able to sustain it, even with all that force. But the British, Chalmers Johnson says, the British after World War II, they realized that they were basically bankrupt, that they couldn't maintain the empire anymore, and so they just gave it up. They figured they'd rather have their national health care program than an empire, and they rather not have a bunch of, armed thug bobbies enforcing the empire's will at home in order to raise the money to do their dirty business abroad. So this is the choice we face right now.
You don't even have to go go to such highfalutin ideology and philosophy. Just examine what we have been told, what we were told by George W. Bush, what we are being told by Barack Obama, what we have been told by the Canadian Prime Minister, Mr. Stephen Harper. The central argument has been we ought to be in Afghanistan because if we are not there, they will come here after us. They'll attack us as terrorists, right? The counter-argument was they might come here precisely because we are there in their country, occupying that country and causing collateral damage of civilians. What has transpired now is in fact worse. They don't even have to come here. Their sympathizers will do it for them. That's what's happening now. I mean, you don't even have to be ideological about this whole thing. Just follow the common sense. So if we are not there to establish the empire, if we are there to stop terrorism, we have failed. If we are there to uplift the women and bring them democracy and all the good things of life, we have failed. So back to my question, what are we doing there?
Well, I don't know.
Sure.
I mean, the guest Fred Bronfman on the show yesterday said it looks to him like we're securing resources for the Chinese. It's their investments.
I have stayed away from all of those theories. We are there for the mineral resources. I mean,
he was saying, in effect, I don't think he was saying that's the purpose of the war or
no,
whatever, but he was saying, that's what we're doing. Same thing with Iraq. We didn't really invade in order to install the Ayatollah Sistani and Muqtada al-Sadr in power in Baghdad, but we did anyway.
Yes. And you see, I mean, the Pentagon put out a report about 8 weeks ago saying the mineral wealth of Afghanistan may run into billions of dollars and so on. It sounded desperate, that somehow there's light at the end of the tunnel, that we will get some resources and so on. But that was, A, that didn't sound for real, and B, that was not the declared purpose of our going there anyway,
Yeah, I mean, that really was pretty cynical where, I mean, that's what people, when they're suspicious, say, well, we're just there for the resources or something. That's what would make it not justified. And then they use that to try to bait the American people into thinking, oh, yeah, well, good, we'll just go in there and take their resources. But if they ever told us that was the purpose of the war, we'd have never supported that.
I'm not saying that is why they have released this report. I mean, it may be genuine, but just to a casual observer, it seems extremely foolish and quite cynical.
Yeah. Well, so what's the political climate like in Canada? Have y'all had enough of this yet? When are you leaving?
We are supposed to leave in July next year, and our Prime Minister sensibly has said we will not extend our military mission, combat mission, so we may find some civilian role for Canada in Afghanistan, which is a sensible thing to do if, in fact, something civilian can be done under the circumstances. Back to my original point that we have managed to pull defeat from the jaws of victory, and we have made such a mess of it that, in fact, civilian work is not possible, has not been possible. I mean, your own president, whom I love and supported to a great extent, he said this, along with this military surge, there will be a parallel civilian surge. We are yet to see it, because it's not possible. Because if it's all in mayhem and we are barely holding ground, how can civilians do what they're supposed to do? It's just a total mess. Boggles the mind, actually.
Well, sure. And we saw their big, I guess it was McChrystal's mistake to drum up so much media attention to the giant government in a box they were going to deliver to Marja. This was going to be the benchmark, the test case for starting the war all over again with the brand new CNAS coin doctrine, and it's a complete miserable failure. The town was, 20,000 or something, not 80,000 like in the lie, and they still can't even pacify a town of 20,000.
You're right. So, I mean, one feels saddened by what has transpired. One doesn't say that with any degree of pleasure. It's just a sad situation.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course it is. I'm not so confident about the legitimacy of all these terrorism cases, including the ones in Canada. It seems like there's almost always an informant on the inside that tricks these people into saying something stupid into a microphone or something. But every time we've seen that the line that the informant uses is look at what Israel's doing in Palestine. Look what America's doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Look at the oil. Look at the this and the that. They never say, don't you hate freedom? They never say, don't you hate the fact that Western women can vote in primary elections and things like this. They always, the snitches, always use foreign policy as the lure, as though the FBI or the Canadian police give them Michael Scheuer's book and say, here's your talking points. Here's how you recruit someone into anti-Western terrorism.
Right. You see, I've always given the benefit of the doubt to the police forces as well as judicial system.
Oh, well, we have a different tradition down here.
Yes,
innocent till proven guilty. Anyway, I got to go. The music's playing. I really appreciate your time, Haroon. I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
All right, everybody. That's Haroon Siddiqui from the Toronto Star. This is Anti-War Radio.